Software architecture seems like a common thing for the large organizations, and it might seem as well that the small startups should avoid it. And in fact, a lot of the startups avoid the software architecture at all by cutting corners and increasing a lot of tech debt. And in this episode, I want to discuss this topic from my first-hand experience because I've been working on a startup lately, and I'll tell you exactly whether software architecture has the place within startups or not. Before we get started, brief news of the channel. I know it's been a while, and that's because, as I already mentioned, I've been working on a startup lately. I'm developing my own product, and the software architecture vlog has shifted its priorities a little bit in my to-do list. However, it's still one of the big passions that I have, so don't worry, you will get more episodes in the future. Another great news, my book, Effective Software Development for Enterprise, which I've been mentioning in the past a lot, has found another form of life on the educative platform. And if you are a little lazy to read the entire book, this form of learning will be much more attractive to you, much more convenient, because you can just read it on your own pace, little chapters with quizzes. So the content is tailored towards the online learning. So I'm happy for my book that it is there on the educative, and thank you to the educative team because they believed in me. They placed my book there on their platform. And the last but not least, I see that I have several new subscribers on the channel. Thank you for subscribing. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click subscribe button and the bell icon so that you receive notifications in the future as I add new episodes. Now let's get to the topic. I guess it's a good idea to start conversation with the startup syndrome. This is a term that I guess I coined with my book. If you have read my book or have taken the course on the educative, actually there I mentioned the startup syndrome, which is how I describe what startups go through their life cycle in the beginning when they start developing their products, and specifically software products. So typically those startups cut a lot of corners, accumulate a lot of tech debt, and they don't really care about software architecture or nice software development patterns or approaches, such as, for instance, test-driven development, behavior-driven development, domain-driven design, and they kind of try to accelerate, to quickly develop something, to quickly take something to the market. That's a great intention. But actually, I guess you know what I'm going to say. The startup syndrome, as I described in my book, has a breaking point. At some point, if you follow that approach that I just described, that little dirty approach, then you will reach that breaking point when your approach becomes slower than the alternate approach, which some other companies are taking, and typically larger companies are taking that to stay more efficient, actually. And you know what, with my latest work on my own startup, I kind of proved the point of existence of the startup syndrome and of the breaking point. They both do exist. I myself went through the startup syndrome. I wanted to develop something fast. I myself reached the breaking point, but luckily I took the alternate approach, which I'm going to describe in the next part of this episode. But before that, I'll tell you that the breaking point is reached within 2 to 3 months. So every startup goes through that huge acceleration in the beginning, which lasts 2 to 3 months only, and then they slow down. Again, it's hard to measure because it seems very normal to slow down as your software product grows, but it's not necessary to happen. And then what you have to realize is you could be a little faster, and the long term it pays back. And by long term, I mean during the next 2 to 3 months after the break point. And you know what's the worst part of the breaking point? It's that most of the startups, after they have reached it, they have no way going back. Because literally you have worked during 2 to 3 months on a product. You have reached certain level of the progress. Now you need to continue building it. And you cannot really go back and redo things, and especially you cannot rewrite the entire application. No founder would approve that. And you're kind of stuck with your almost like, prototype or throwaway code, which has become a production version. And now we have to continue enhancing it until at the later point, which typically happens after 5 to 10 years, when somebody finally decides bravely enough to refactor or to write the entire application to another platform or something like that. So yes, if you have reached the breaking point and you have taken this cut all the corners approach, I'm sorry, it's going to get much worse. Now, what's the alternative? The good news is that alternative exists, and we all know well enough about this, but it's nothing other than an approach to do the right thing at the right time. So I'll give you a couple of practical advices which you can apply to your work if you are working on a startup or are thinking to build your own product. Again, I've done all of this, so don't worry, you can try these things at home. First, at all cost, avoid tech debt. Tech debt, as you know, is something that you accumulate over time. Basically, it's almost like not flossing your teeth when the plaque accumulates over your gum lines. It's the same thing. If you don't avoid tech debt, it will accumulate, and then you will have to do much more work in the future, and much more than the total of those little works that you have to do now. So it's absolutely worth investing this time now to avoid the tech debt. And avoiding the tech debt means a lot of things, but typically that means to clean up the code, to make decisions before you write code, and so on. So on that note, you have to define your solution and application architecture before you start your work. And the next couple of things I'm going to mention are going to sound crazy, because let alone startups, not even large companies, are doing them from time to time. But anyway, they help me a lot with my startup work, and they are test-first approach, and specifically I practice behavior-driven development, where I write tests first using the Gherkin language. By the way, I use my own framework, which I have created for this specific purpose, and which is also available on GitHub for download. But I also practice such things as domain-driven design, basically designing bounded context, domains, subdomains, and defining microservices around them. And now I know it's time that a lot of developers will ask me a question: how is test-first development helping you? It's typically slowing others down, so how is it helping you? But the answer is that it's not slowing anybody down. Everybody who thinks that it slows them down, they're not really practicing test-driven development. They're thinking about writing tests after the code, which is really slowing you down, perhaps because you have to write this test after the code is working. Why bother with the test? A lot of people don't even see the purpose behind such activity, and I kind of partly agree. Writing the test before the code typically helps me implement the business functionality or the testable functionality without even running the application. That has huge advantage, and it saves a lot of time for startups. Yes, you're surprised, but for startups, because you can write a lot of edge cases and you can cover them without even running your application. Now imagine, let's say you're writing some kind of application, and I'm writing an application for software developers and architects, but in your application you as well will have many use cases just like I do. And now imagine writing one use case using a code without writing tests first. Now you have to run the application. You see it works, some things don't work, now you stop it, now you need to fix it, now you run it again, click the buttons again, see if the things work, if the screen looks good, oh, something is wrong, stop again. Now again, fix things, now run it and stop it until it looks good. Now we can move to the next scenario, and the next scenario, and the next scenario. Now with behavior-driven development or another test-first approach, you can easily do those things without even single run of the application. And that's what I do, right? It's funny that in a startup, it helps me move faster because I don't have to run and debug my application so many times, thanks to the test-first approach, in my case specifically behavior-driven development. Now, next topic is the dates or the deadlines. This is very critical for the startups. You want to target some dates, you want to deliver your product on time, you don't want to waste more time than you would otherwise, and that's a great goal to target. But I want to also encourage you to think about MVPs rather than thinking to push a lot of features into the release and trying to accelerate that way and deliver a lot to the market. Instead, rethink your backlog and understand what has the most positive impact on your customer's experience, and work on those features first. That will give you most return on your investment, because as you think about the impact, low-hanging fruits should go first, right? And that's natural. In the startups, you are looking for the low-hanging fruits, something that will delight your customers, and it's easy to do, but you should find those and tackle them first. And then you will ask me, okay, now I'm doing all of this, what's next? Next, know that after you reach the breaking point, you might not even feel it, which is great news. You will not slow down because initially you invested more in doing the right thing. But remember that you are faster than other startups. So after 2 or 3 months, you are faster than other startups. That's also another great news. So continue flossing. Now, I know that we didn't speak much about software architecture itself, but all things that I mentioned are the supporting mechanisms and disciplines toward building the right software architecture. And as I briefly mentioned, it's important to think about the software architecture, and as you accelerate using those techniques that I mentioned earlier, you will have more time to conveniently rethink and rebuild your architecture and to build it from ground up in the right fashion, so that you think through your solution architecture, application architecture, even in a way about enterprise architecture, or how your startup or your product is going to turn from this little code base into the large product which might deliver large revenues. Now, I explained my own experience with my startup product. What's your experience? Do you feel that you disagree with my words? And regardless whether you agree or disagree, this is a nice conversation, so let's keep this going. Click the subscribe button and the notification icon, and I'll keep you notified when I post new episodes in the future. Now go build some great products.